Hi and welcome to the first video in the build video series for the T-Rex 600 ESP. And for this first build video I'm really going to break with tradition and not follow the manual at all. And the reason I'm going to do that is because typically on an aligned build the first few pages deal with building up the rotor head. And the T-Rex 600 ESP is no exception to this. Pages 4, 5, 6 and 7 and half of page 8 all deal with building up the rotor head and also putting together the main gears. And I'm not actually going to do that as the first part of my build. Now the reason I'm going to do that is because typically once you've built the rotor head you then have nothing to do with it until the very end of the build where you install it into your frames. And if you're anything like me, that rotor head's going to get knocked or sat on or damaged in some way whilst it's built and not installed into the model itself. So the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to build up my frames, put the tail on, and then build the rotor head last and install it onto the model. And the rotor head is, if you think about it, the most delicate part of the model. You could argue that the tail is also quite delicate, but the rotor head is the thing that you really don't want to damage, and it's got lots of bits poking out of it and it's quite unwieldy. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to build it first and then leave it sitting around waiting to get damaged. So we're going to kick off with building the frames, and I've just got the parts out here for the first step of this on page 8 of the manual. We've got two main frames here, the metal bearing blocks, the bottom tray, canopy posts. This is just a strengthening post that goes at the front of the frames, and these are the various nuts and retaining washers that we're going to use as part of building up those frames. So I'm going to get the bits that I need to do the assembly, standard Allen keys and some Loctite, and we can crack on. Okay, so here we have the first completed build step on page 8. I'm just going to take you through what I've put on here. The bottom tray on the frames has been put on with 2 screws, as you can see here and here, and these are just the small 10mm self-tapping screws. You can see I've got 4 threaded bolts which are holding the metal blocks on there. Now those bolts which I've got in the back there, those are just dry fitted. I haven't Loctited or done those up tight, because before we do up those 4 bolts and the 4 bolts that go the other side and the other side frame that comes on here, we want to get a main shaft down through here to make sure that the 2 bearing blocks are aligned with one another. So we mustn't tighten those up or Loctite them until we've got the main shaft in. The other thing I want to point out is the way these bearing blocks are orientated. And the way to do it correctly is the top one should have the writing on it, which you can see there, and the bearing retainer. And the one underneath is the opposite way up, and the bearing retainer is actually underneath there. And that was my dog just giving it approval. So we can see the bearing retainer underneath there. Now the reason they're done like that is because if you think about it, when you've got the main shaft in there, you have the main shaft retaining collar on the top here, and it's pushing down on this bearing retainer here, so effectively holding that on, which means that this retainer isn't being stressed or pulled on these little bolts that are holding it on. And similarly the main gear is underneath here and is pushing up onto that bearing retainer, again holding it in rather than trying to pull it away from the bolts. So that's why they're orientated the way they are. Then at the front we've got just a frame brace and then a screw at the back here holding the canopy post on. So that's it, and now we need to put the other side frame onto that, and then we can start installing other parts into our frames. Okay, and there we have the other side frame now installed, exactly the same as the first one, and you can see we now have the bare minimum of a frame set, and we can now start installing other parts into that. Okay, so here we have the next parts we're going to install. These are the little servo holders which I actually omitted to install in the previous step. Didn't notice them, but as I was back checking I noticed I hadn't put those in, so those will go in, and they use these little small self-tapping screws to install those with washers. Then you've got the two rear trays, which are these, the motor mount, and then this is the front battery tray, or the front of the battery tray if you want to call it that, which goes up the front, which we need to also install. So I'll go ahead and install those. Okay, so here we have our frames with those build parts completed. You can see you have the motor mount down in there. You can see that it's the smooth, the kind of flat side towards the top, and if we look at the bottom side you can see down in there that it's the slatted side that goes towards the bottom. Loctite on these screws, unlike the bearing blocks, which should still just be a dry fit and not have any Loctite on them yet or be tightened up at this stage, just loose fitted. But these ones Loctite them up, tighten them up. We've got the front tray on there, as you can see, and that's held on with these two screws here, and the same the other side. And at the back of the frames we've got the two trays which are just held on with a single self tapper with no washer. Same the other side. And then also I installed the little servo mounting parts which provide the plastic screw holes for the servo screws to go into, and you can see, if you look down in there, you can see how they're mounted. One here, and the same below, and they just provide those screw holes for the servo screws. Okay, so that's all the parts in that build step. The next thing we're going to move on to is installing the elevator A-arm, which goes on the shared CCPM shaft, which kind of goes in here. Okay, so here we have our shared CCPM shaft with the elevator control A-arm on it, and our aileron control horns as well. We need to do a little bit of assembly on this. These screws here are actually loose, so we need to Loctite those in place, and then we need to uninstall these parts off of it so we can put the shaft through the frames, and then we can put those back on again with the appropriate washers and all that kind of stuff. First of all though, I'm going to Loctite these screws and disassemble this so we can put the shaft into the frames. Okay, so here we have our elevator and aileron shared CCPM shaft assembly, which I've taken apart, and the only thing I've done is I've just installed the ball link into the end of the A-arm. And when you do that, just make sure that the A, which is on the little ball link at the top here, is the same side as the T-Rex 600 lettering underneath here. So the next thing we need to do is to get these balls installed onto the various different control horns before we install the CCPM shaft into the machine. Okay, so there we have the balls installed, so you can see that one's got balls on that side and a single ball the other side, and the same for the other aileron. And then the elevator balls installed as well. So the next thing we can do is install our CCPM shaft into the frames. Okay, so here we have our shaft, and I've put a control horn and one of the spacers onto it, and also what you'll find is that there are some shims provided which allow you to shim the shaft so that there's no play in it, and I've just done a dry fit with mine just to have a look to see what it requires, and it needs one shim either side. So we also need to put one of these shims onto the shaft, like so, and then we can get our frames and we can thread the shaft onto the frames like that. And then we need to take our elevator A-arm and place that inside the frames and put the shaft through it. so. Right, all the way through. Like so, and out the other side. And then we put another shim on that side. And then we need our spacer. So, and then our other control horn. Which will go on there like that. But I just noticed that this control horn I need to swap the balls on because the balls are actually the wrong way round, and the horn actually needs to go on the other way round. So I'll just do that. Okay, so that's it all installed. You can see the elevator control horn is on there, like so, and you've got your aileron control horns here and no play in the shaft. And what I want to show you is how these parts need to line up, because it's really easy to get these on the wrong way around, and you may have to swap your balls around on these aileron control horns to get this right. But basically the servo output shaft is down here, so this is going to sit at an angle like that, with the control rods coming parallel to one another up to here, and then your ball here needs to be in between the two servo holes over here. So you can see that that control horn is aligned correctly. And if we look at the one on the other side, we have exactly the same situation. So the control shaft for the servo is down here, the control horn, the control rods will go up to there and up to there in parallel from the servo shaft here, and then the ball is going to be in the middle there between those two servo screw holes. And that's how you know you've got this assembled correctly. And if you haven't got it right, then you just need to take these control horns off and just swap the balls around and turn them round and put them back on again, and it should be okay. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be building is the undercarriage to go onto our frames, and that then gives us a stable platform that we can build the rest of the helicopter around. So I've dug out the undercarriage here. We've got the struts and then the pipes which form the undercarriage. These rubbers are to stop the helicopter skidding around on a concrete or slippery surface. We've got the stops which go in the ends of the pipes or skids. The screws, washers and nuts for mounting the undercart to the frames, and then these little grub screws here, they actually go in this hole here and they stop the skid from moving up and down within the hole of the strut. So I'm going to put this together and we can see what it looks like when it's built. Okay, so there we have our built undercarriage. As you can see, I put the rubbers on the inside of the struts here, and what that means is that you never lose these, because with them on the outside here they can come off the end and get lost, and similarly on the front. So if you put them inside the struts you'll never lose them. Grub screws are in place here holding the skids in place, and I've used a tiny bit of thick CA on the stops for the skid pipes to hold them in place. And all that remains now is to bolt these onto the bottom of the frames with the provided screws, nuts and washers, which I've got here. So I shall go ahead and do that. Okay, and there we have the undercarriage bolted onto the frames. Now if I just swing this over, you can see the bolts and washers on the underside, and then the nylock nuts in the top here. So the next thing I'm going to move on to is bolting into the back of the frames here the gearbox for the shaft drive.